If I can jump around the questions just a little bit,
Oh, by all means, I jump around everywhere.
Just because I think it flows better with what you're talking about. So, we have Wounded Knee in 1973, and then I would say the common understanding, even amongst a large section of the left, is that post 73, AIM eventually falls apart and becomes a part of history, similar to the Black Panther Party, right? Like, AIM has this sort of historical understanding from people on the left. And, as you've stated at the very top, like, AIM is still technically around.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get from, the occupations, the very famous events of the 1970s and late 1960s to today for AIM? How does AIM develop post sort of this historic period?
Well, and so yeah, 1973 is sort of like the what's it called, coup de grace of, like, the story, right? Like, it's this huge moment, and you think revolution's around the corner, right? Same thing that happened with the APL. And they don't stop organizing. They organize very heavily, but what we see is this mass amount of repression. And the way this occurs is sort of we have to connect Black Panthers and AIM beyond their just immediate, hey, we'll help each other where we're happen to be in the same spot, right? Like, Oakland Black Panthers helped the Alcatraz occupation. In Minneapolis, you had a group called the Soul Patrol that would end up becoming affiliated with the Black Panthers. Like, there's a bunch of different examples, but one of the biggest ways they're connected is through the repression they faced. And so with the Black Panthers, we know, was the last official group targeted by the COINTELPRO operation that would seek to disrupt communists, Black nationalists, and then end, quote unquote, after anti-war activists raid the FBI headquarters and find these documents that show a conspiracy to disenfranchise members of undesirable political movements. And it ends technically, and the Church Commission comes about because of it. And what we find is these tactics described in the Church Commission are being deployed in 1973 on a larger scale that's more interconnected. Not that these agencies have ever been very disconnected in their operations, but we see the U.S. deploy paramilitary arms, the FBI, the CIA, fucking Marines, the Air Force. Like, these are all deployed on the occupation of Wounded Knee. You have flares lighting up the sky all night long. There's all kinds of things that happen. There's even, like, hearsay about a Marine's death that isn't reported, at Wounded Knee. And so, like, and it's because of how illegal this is. Right, if we become citizens in 1923 and you deny us treaty making, then why the fuck are you deploying Marines on us? That's illegal as fuck. And so we see this guy Douglas Durham be introduced to the story, and Douglas Durham comes from Des Moines, AIM, right? And he was a former cop, is the story he tells. And the story is backed up by a couple newspaper clippings he just happens to have, right? Where one's about him buying rice. And another one comes from The Workshop, the infamous CIA-ran newspaper out of Des Moines. So, like, there's these fake paper stories, like one in, like, a real newspaper about him buying rice, and then all of a sudden he's caught... he's a security guard at this warehouse, right? And he's caught stealing and selling shit, which is the whole reason he was hired as a security guard, right? And so this guy, he just happens to have a pilot's license, and he's like, Dennis, I got you. Let's go flee. We'll fly up to Canada, chill out up there, and he becomes like best friends with Dennis Banks. They become best friends, and up until like 1975, he's the lead. He's the head of the American Indian Movement's national security. You know, nobody could talk to Russell Means or Dennis Banks except through him. You know, and then you also have figures like Ward Churchill, which there's a photo of a guy who looks oddly like him coming out of the same helicopters bringing the FBI agents. Ward Churchill would be an instrumental figure alongside Russell Means as he turned towards like the Libertarian Party and running with like Hustler CEO Larry Flint or whatever, and fucking would work for Alex Jones and shit. Like the guy influenced it. Oh, and they try to smuggle guns to the Contras. You know, the history of AIM starts to get complex after Wounded Knee because you have like this mass amount of repression where there's so he's an FBI informant, Douglas Durham, at this point, but he was a former CIA chaos agent. And these are similar programs, COINTELPRO and Chaos. I don't know, and I forget the NSA's program off the top of my head right now, but that's besides the point. Nobody ever talks about that one, and I always try to talk about it because it's not publicized very often. I don't know what notebook it would be in. I have too many notebooks around me at this very moment, and so
Don't worry.
it does not help. But yeah. So anyway, freaking, you know, there's this considerable effort to disrupt what they're doing, and they have eyes inside these personal lawyer discussions between the people they're prosecuting, right? And so Dennis Banks and Russell Means get out of all trouble specifically because of this dynamic becoming revealed, right? They end up discovering Douglas Durham is an agent at the 1975 75 occupation. No, 74. I forget the exact date, but the occupation of the Alexian Brother Novitiate in Gresham, Wisconsin. Again, another place I drive if I want to add 30 minutes to my trip. Boop. You know, and so what happens there is they're digging through his van and they find check stubs. Like hidden in the vinyl of the roof, right? And then very interesting story. But he ends up leaving with that girl I mentioned that ends up being murdered. She's found soon after they're murdered. And then not too long after that, the same car that he drives is the car that's last seen taking Anime Aquash. So it's, yeah, like that entire story is very complicated too. Not something I like to get into due to the controversiality, and I'm waiting on a couple people to publish books who are more closely related to this, because Bruce Allison drops her off at the place she's last seen, and then leaves. So Bruce Allison's writing a book on the subject, and then Nick Estes is as well. And so, you know, they have more credentials than me. So let them handle it, you know. But you know, needless to say, you know, there's this huge complex history of, you know, what happens after with these court hearings, you know, who goes to jail, because there's still people, you know, that are affected by the legal issues that happened back then. You know, like my grandma was considered a domestic terrorist into the 90s, you know. But what we see is a ton of organizing still, and it's not as flashy as Wounded Knee because it can't be. Now they're under extreme repression. You have, they don't know it yet, but and the very top brass, you know, FBI agent, and then Ward Churchill has never been confirmed a Fed or anything like that, but it is interesting, you know, what evidence, you know, like he was like writing for Soldier of Fortune, a right-wing paramilitary, like, you know, like weird. And then like I've talked to him, and like he spent like hours talking about the war of northern aggression. That's how he kept saying it. And I was like, that's loaded, bro. Like I was texting my producer, what the fuck? Yeah. So interesting conversation to say the least. But yeah, it's and then he does this this Mr. X thing, right? There's a Mr. X. Oh, hold on. Remind me of Mr. X, because we'll get to that. Okay. And so they start doing like smaller scale, like more realistic, less flashy things. So they're building community gardens. They're um, giving talks and lectures for education. They're helping with schools. They start these things called survival schools, which are these beautiful things that last up until the early 2010s, the early aughts. And so like but it took students who traditionally only 15% of them will graduate in a classic public school education at the time, and it turned it into an 85% graduation rate by teaching our culture and our history to us. And that's, Michigan happens to have a higher turnout rate of graduation amongst natives. And I contribute that directly to the fact that we do get more education about native issues here than in other places. It's not a lot, but it is better, and it's that little bit that makes people not alienated from the society. Because when you're constantly hearing about the people who murdered your people as good people, you don't feel good, psychologically. You feel very unwanted. You feel different constantly. When your name's Shungmani too, everyone's like, I got something easier. You're like, oh, I can't even have my name. The school took my name from me and made me have a different name. Like that. It's a very weird thing. And like, we got briefly taught about Wounded Knee, and I was like, you need to shut up. Like, he said, what? I was like, this is like my family you're talking. This is all wrong. Like, you're just lying to these kids, dude. Like, you're telling them there's hostages. No, they volunteered to stay, But the next big event is the incident at Oglala, as that famous movie's named. But it's the shooting at the Jumping Bull Ranch, which was a very interesting issue because, again, they're building community gardens, but the government says the potato sellers, the root sellers, are bunkers like at Wounded Knee, right? And then on the maps that they use to get their warrants, they called the Jumping Bull Ranches the Black Elks because the Black Elks were directly involved in Wounded Knee. And so then it would look like they're doing this on somebody who's already supported armed struggle, right? And you have what's called, I forget the exact phrasing, but you have like 5 major laws that allow the federal government to come onto a reservation and like execute warrants and stuff. And that's due to how the sovereignty of like state, federal, and tribal powers work. And it's federal, tribal, and they're actually kind of supposed to be equal to a point, but one's like a paternalistic, and then states can affect the other two, right? And so they use these theft of boots to come down, and it ends up that Joe Stunt's AIM member gets murdered, and then 2 FBI agents end up dead. And when the government likes to talk about this, they don't like to mention Joe Stunts, and it's really sad because, like, I visit his grave a lot, like he shouldn't have died. Like that guy they came looking for is like Jimmy Eagle or something like that. And he wasn't there. He's never there, and then they go chasing after, they give several different vehicles that were supposedly Peltiers, and they go chasing after him. There's like a whole like group ready to ambush that had been coming in since the morning. So it's like this was a planned thing, they were literally planning on raiding this place, and then it went south, and 2 FBI agents get murdered by a gun that Leonard Peltier did not use. Leonard Peltier gets put in prison because they omit the ballistics evidence from the trial in a gun trial. There's no ballistic evidence because then it will show that the gun Leonard Peltier used was not the one that fired the bullets. Well, there's even confession tapes and stuff like the Mr. X thing. And so Mr. X is a person filmed. Oh, I used to know whose house it was filmed in. But anyway, um, they put on this costume and I'm the one who killed him, blah, 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 blah. And that was Dave Hill, who's also known as the Mount Rushmore bomber. He was arrested. He knew how to make bombs. Marlon Brando once gave them an RV, and Marlon Brando once gave them an RV, and they were smuggling explosives across the country. Where did Matt go? But they were smuggling explosives across the country, and later on, it becomes that he's accused of trying to blow up Mount Rushmore, never did, and then so he's Mr. X and talks about this stuff, and tries to create this story that's like it's not him, because it isn't Leonard Peltier, but then this makes that reality look bad, and the person who orchestrates this sort of scheme is Ward Churchill. I think maybe it was Ward's house even that I was filming. I'll have to ask David, but my grandma ends up saving Dave Hill's kid's life from a rattlesnake bite, so like a close family friend, and my grandma ends up being the assistant director or whatever of AIM Security, like after the Durham shit, and so just very well connected to the story, but I've talked with these people about it, and it's that's where it ends, like in people's imagination, right? Like that's where, like, not to these people who actually lived it, but in everyone's head, that's where AIM ends, is Leonard Peltier going to prison for shit he didn't do, and he's only now on house arrest. Like that, I mean, he only now sees the outside of the bars. Like he never met his son outside the bars of prison. His son was born after he goes into prison, and his son dies the day before lobbying Obama in the room next door to Nick Estes. Like it's I couldn't imagine the pain, like that's harsh. And so people are organizing for his freedom. People are organizing, the International Indian Treaty Council, which ends up becoming a huge part of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People that was only ratified this century. We have a long-standing history that just gets wiped under these big flashy events, and like this, it is a nice narrative closure, right? Amen. After this, just fizzles out. But in reality, it keeps going. It fractionalizes, like I said, between a national group, an autonomous group, and then like a women's group, essentially, that kind of just like organized underneath the great men of these two factions as their own faction. And that's kind of a part of like the grassroots. So I kind of call it like four factions essentially that exist to this day. And like the autonomous AIM groups, you start to see like Nazi chapters pop up. Not cool. You see an attempt to make a alliance with the Aryan Brotherhood. One of the dumbest ideas I've ever heard in my life. And that's like a lot of Russell Means and Ward Churchill shit. So Ward Churchill and Russell Means become sort of like the figureheads with Glenn Morris, who's still like the figurehead for Denver, Dakota AIM. But Ward Churchill and Russell specifically were like kind of like the big, like outspoken, until they're ostracized essentially. Russell quits like 7 times, and then like I mentioned, he tries to smuggle guns into to the Contra. Well, it's to a group of Mosquito who were working with the Contras due to failures of the Sandinista to appropriately address those contradictions effectively, right? So like that's one of the big things like people need to be aware of. You can just drive groups into the hands of Nazis very easily if you just don't consider them, in your planning. Like that's one of the biggest issues, and we've seen it happen with the Sandinistas. We've seen it happen across the world with revolutions that are affected by the colonial question. Those internal contradictions come to rot out what pillars of revolution exist or were built up, because the foundation's faulty, and that's why I think it's so important to know this history and stuff, is that these are the contradictions the CIA and FBI presses on using people like Ward Churchill and stuff, they'll pretend to be advocates for this specifically so they can push buttons and push people away, either to the Nazis, in some form. They want to push them away from the decolonial struggle because it's one that's easily unifiable. It easily unifies a lot of people, and you can see directly with how much it spurred environmentalist momentum, and the environmentalists become the target of the COINTELPRO projects, and only after the environmentalists are basically neutralized do we start to see this huge, they start focusing on fundamentalist Christians, they start, that's when they start to like, oh, well, maybe we should watch them a little bit. Oklahoma City was kind of, and you have groups like the John Birch Society, who like Alex Jones's dad was like a member of. And then Russell Means, the John Birch Society tried to assassinate Russell Means, and then Russell Means works for one of their sons. What? Very confusing, that faction, right? We can all agree. And the smuggling the guns thing comes out of like this secret meeting with Elliot Abrams and Oliver North, like before the Iran-Contra scandal happens. So this is like the precursor to why the Iran-Contra scandal even happens. Very fascinating.
And Russell Means just as a figure is fascinating, because then he becomes like a movie star. Like, honestly, like that's how I know him, is from movies, like, so Russell Means fascinating figure. And